years, we are going on with our film studies. Today we are doing French Poetic Realism. French Poetic Realism. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed some important contributions of France to the avant-garde and experimental cinema. The 1920s and 1930s, the decades, witnessed also some important contributions of France to the avant-garde. Avant-garde means experimental films, films of experimentation, avant-garde and experimental cinema. The film industry in France before 1935 was determined by two major film trusts, 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 film companies, film trusts, PATH, P-A-T-H-E, PATH, and government, G-A-U-M-O-U-N-D, government. PATH and government were two film trusts which determined the film industry in France before 1935, which were the two film trusts that determined the film industry of France before the year 1935, PATH and government. The abolition of the trusts in the mid-1930s paved the way for the emergence of small independent filmmakers. You know, the trusts, PATH and government were abolished in the mid-1930s, in the middle of 1930s. And the abolition of the trusts, film trusts in the mid-1930s paved the way for the emergence coming up of small, independent, free filmmakers, film producers. When the trust got abolished, small filmmakers, film producers came into existence. These producers, these small independent producers, influenced the revival of art cinema. They were the exponents of art cinema. These small, independent or free filmmakers influenced the revival of art cinema in France, especially between the years 1935 and 1939. The 4 years, the period of 4 years was a period of experimentation in art cinema by the small scale producers. So the producers, small independent producers, influenced the revival of the art cinema in France, especially between 1935 and 1939. The most noted figures of this poetic realist movement. So this movement, this cinema movement or cinematic movement or film movement during the period from 1935 to 1939 is called the Poetic Realist movement. Poetic Realist movement or the Poetic Realism in cinema. The Poetic Realist movement, where the famous filmmakers during this Poetic Realist movement between 1935 and 1939 were Wes Allegre, Y-V-E-S-A-L-L-E-G-R-E-T, Wes Allegre. Often his film belongs to the category of Nova genre. N-O-I-R, Nova genre. His films usually belong to the category of Nova genre. That is Nova genre. Nova genre is primarily used to describe the stylish crime dramas or gangster movies, you might know. gangster movies, stylish crime dramas. Particularly those films that emphasize the cynical attitudes and sexual motivations. The films which represent cynical attitudes, cynical, finding fault, cynical attitudes and sexual motivations. Or in brief, we can say gangster movies or crime dramas. They are called Noah genre films. Noah genre films. N-O-I-R, Noah. Noah genre films. Bess Allegre was an exponent of Noah genre film. And other famous filmmakers of this moment were Marcel Carné, M-A-R-C-E-L-C-A-R-N-E, Marcel Carné, Julian Dewey, Jean Grimmelin, Jean, J-E-A-N, it is pronounced as Jean Grimmelin, and an most important filmmaker, Jean Reno. They were the most important poetic realist filmmakers. Who were they? Bess Allegre, Marcel Carné, Julian Dewey, Jean Grimmelin, and Jean Reno. They were the most important French poetic realist filmmakers. Marcel Albert Carné, a key figure in the poetic realism movement. He was a key figure. He was one of the most important poetic realist filmmakers. Or we can say he was a key figure, an important figure in the poetic realism movement. His best known films include Port of Shadows. This film would be the first to be called a film noir. It was a tragedy, it was a tragic film. It was a tragedy and a film of poetic realism. Port of Shadows, one of his most important films. Then The Devil's Envoys. The Devil's Envoys. It is a 1942 film during the Nazi occupation of Paris. Which film? Devil's Envoys. And another important film by him, most important film by him, that is Children of Paradise. Children of Paradise. It is a 1945 epic drama. It was made during the German occupation of France during the Second World War. This film was produced during the German occupation of France during the Second World War. These are the most important films by Marcel Albert Carné. And you see Julian Dewey, he was a French film director and screenwriter. Among his most original films, chiefly notable films, among his most important films, most original films are La Bandera, it means Escape from Yesterday. The English title is Escape from Yesterday. La Bandera. Then there is Pep Le Moko. 1937 French film. The plot of Pep Le Moko involves the trapping of a gangster. It is also a gangster film. The trapping of a gangster by a detective. And Panic, P-A-N-I-Q-U is the French spelling. It is Panic, P-A-N-I-C, Panic in English, Panic. Then there is Jean Grimmelin. His best film is Venezia Classicsa, which is his best film. Venezia Classicsa is his best film. Then one of the most important poetic realist filmmakers is Jean Reno, Jean-Renoir. Jean Reno. He was a French film director, actor, screenwriter, producer and author. He was many things rolled into one. His greatest films are La Grande Illusion. La Grande Illusion, the English title is The Grand Illusion. The Grand Illusion. The Grand Illusion. It is a 1937 French film. The story concerns a story revolves around the class relationship among a small group of French officers. It is made on the background of war. It is a war film. Which is a war film? La Grande Illusion, The Grand Illusion. And his most important film is The Rules of the Game. Rules of the Game. It is a 1939 French satirical comedy drama. It is a satirical comedy drama. Satirical comedy drama. Which is a satirical comedy drama? It is The Rules of the Game, directed by Jean Reno. And these poetic realists, their production of films enabled French cinema to regain its weakening reputation after the First World War. After the First World War, the French cinema was on the decline. The weakening reputation of the cinema was regained by the strenuous and sincere efforts of these filmmakers, these French poetic realist filmmakers. Then the historical context, the historical context of the rise and fall of the Popular Friend Party. Popular Friend Party, it was a leftist party. The historical context of the rise and fall of the Popular Friend Party had a connection with the emergence of the school of Poetic Realism. When we study the growth and development of Poetic Realism, we can see that the growth and development of Poetic Realism in France, of course, has close connection with the rise and fall of the leftist party, Popular Friend Party. Popular Friend Party. Friend Populaire, it was called in French so. It was an alliance of the left-wing movement. The party was an alliance group of the left-wing movement. So when we examine the growth of the Poetic Realism in France, we can easily see that it has close connection with the rise and decline, fall of the leftist alliance party, the alliance of the left-wing called Popular Friend Party. The Popular Friend Party, which came to power in 1936, had promised an array, plenty of social reforms. The party which came into power in 1936 had promised that the people a lot of social reforms, and people became extremely happy. People found that a heaven is going to be made on earth by the political party. See, the party which came to power in 1936 had promised an array of social reforms which generated, their promise generated a wave of optimism in the minds of the masses. The left party's promise generated or created a wave of optimism in the minds of the masses. They believed that a better tomorrow is going to happen. They earnestly believed that they are going to get a welfare government. But the political and economic degradation that followed. But soon after, we know during the Second World War, the political and economic degradation happened. There was a steady decline in economic phase the political and economic degradation that followed, and the threat of war, the threat of the Second World War challenged the execution of reforms envisioned by the party. Two things: the political and economic degradation which followed and the threat of Second World War challenged the execution or the putting into practice of reforms envisaged by the party. These alternate waves of optimism and pessimism, the alternative waves of optimism and pessimism were reflected in the films of the time. The oscillation of pessimism and optimism, the moving of pessimism and optimism in the minds of the masses were reflected in the films of the time, films of the Second World War time. Jean Reno's Le Crime D.M. Lange. Le Crime D.M. Lange. The English title is The Crime of Monseiur. The French Monseiur, the French Monseiur means Mr. Monseiur Lange, which came out in the year 1935. Le Crime D.M. Lange. The Crime of Monseiur Lange, which came out in the year 1935. And Lavest announced, the English title is Life is Us. Life is Us, which got released in the year 1936. These films portrayed the working class solidarity, the working class unity. These films which portrayed the working class solidarity represent the optimism of this movement. On the one side, the films like The Crime of Monseiur Lange, which came out in the year 1935, and Life is Us, which came out in the next year, 1936, they represent the optimism. They represent the sense of optimism in the minds of the people during this period. And the ensuing depression. The ensuing or the coming depression or desperation at the decline of the Popular Front. Popular Front, the political party, the leftist party, Popular Front, gave rise to the deeply pessimistic movies. On the other hand, the people's depression at the decline of the Popular Front, the political party or the government of the Popular Front gave rise to the deeply pessimistic movies. Some pessimistic movies were generated out of this. Pessimistic movies like Marcel Carné's Koi de Brum. The English title is Port of Shadows. Port of Shadows in 1938. Port of Shadows. Then his another film, Le Joie Se Lève. Le Joie Se Lève. That means Sun Goes Up, which came out in the year 1939. These films, the Port of the Shadow, which I have discussed earlier, the Port of the Shadows, and the Sun Goes Up, they are pessimistic films. These pessimistic films were the outcome of the pessimistic feelings which arose in the minds of the masses because of the decline of the Popular Front party. That is why it is aptly said that the rise of the Popular Front and the decline of the Popular Front, these two elements caused optimistic films as well as pessimistic films which fall upon the category of poetic realist films. poetic realist French films. So another film which belong to this category is Renault's, Jean Renault's La Regal du La Regal du, The Rules of the Game, an important film. You should watch it, The Rules of the Game, which came out in the year 1939. It also belongs to the category of the poetic realistic film, which came out during the war period.
J'ai le plaisir de vous présenter ma dernière acquisition. Et elle est l'aboutissement de ma carrière. Je crois que la chose vous plaira. Je vous les use.
Tu es un ange dangereux, mais un ange tout de même. C'est une femme du monde, et ce monde-là, ça a ses règles, des règles très rigoureuses.
All these films of this time, all these types of these films were formed to reflect the optimism and pessimism of this period. All these films were formed or created or produced to reflect or show the optimism and pessimism of this period. See, Julien Dave's works, Peplameko and La Belle Équipe were echoing undying pessimistic messages. These films were echoing undying pessimistic messages in the early optimistic period. You know, Julien Dave's films were echoing undying pessimistic messages in the early optimistic period. He was not a sympathizer of the political party, the left party. Actually, he never was an activist of the left political party. Even then, he was totally disappointed by the decline of the political party that reflected in his films, and thus his films became highly pessimistic. He was not a sympathizer actually. He was not a sympathizer of the left party. Then Jean Grémillon, an important filmmaker. Jules Diamond, French word difficult to pronounce. Jules Diamond, 1837 was a black film which told the destruction of a man who neglects his duties, who forgoes his duties, who neglects his duties. Then Surrealism was a major influencer in the films of this genre. Surrealism was a major influence, a deep influence. Surrealism produced a deep influence on the films of this genre, which were characterized by a story emphasis on a mise-en-scène, decorations, setting and lighting. Surrealism was brought into movies with the help of mise-en-scène. We already studied mise-en-scène, decorations, setting and lighting. These films portrayed a kind of recreated realism. These surrealistic films brought about a recreated realism. അക്കാലത്തുണ്ടായ വേറൊരു മെത്തേഡായിരുന്നു സറിയലിസ്റ്റിക് ഫിലിംസ്. ഈ സറിയലിസം ക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിരുന്നത് ഈ നാല് കാര്യങ്ങളുടെ സഹായത്തോടെയാണ്. മിസൺസൺ, ഡെക്കറേഷൻസ്, സെറ്റിങ്, പിന്നെ ലൈറ്റിങ്. അപ്പോൾ അതെന്താണ്, ഒരു റിയാലിറ്റി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ റിയലിസത്തെ റീക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു ഈ മിസൺസണിൻ്റെയും ലൈറ്റിങ്ങിൻ്റെയും ഡെക്കറേഷൻ്റെയും സെറ്റിങ്ങിൻ്റെയും സഹായത്താൽ റിയലിസത്തെ ക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതാണ്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് കോൾഡ് റീക്രിയേറ്റഡ് റിയലിസം. Recreated realism, it is known as recreated realism, which could be differentiated from the socio-realism of the documentary. ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയുടെ റിയലിസം അല്ല. ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയിൽ യഥാർത്ഥമായി കാണുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ എന്താണോ, എന്താ ക്യാമറ ഒരു മിറർ പോലെ പ്രതിഫലിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററിയിൽ. ഇതിൽ റിയലിസം നിന്ന് റീക്രിയേറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നു മിസൺസിൻ്റെ സഹായത്താലും ലൈറ്റിങ്ങിൻ്റെ സഹായത്താലും ഡെക്കറേഷൻ്റെ സഹായത്താലും സെറ്റിങ്ങിൻ്റെ സഹായത്താലും റിയലിസം ഈസ് റീക്രിയേറ്റഡ് ഇൻ ദീസ് സറിയലിസ്റ്റിക് ഫിലിംസ്. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വൈ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് കോൾഡ് റീക്രിയേറ്റഡ് റിയലിസം. സോ ഇറ്റ് ക്യാൻ ബി ഡിഫറൻഷിയേറ്റഡ് ഫ്രം ദി സോഷ്യോ റിയലിസം ഓഫ് ദി ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് റിയലിസം, ഓഫ് കോഴ്സ്. ദി റിയലിസം മീൻസ് ദി ക്വാളിറ്റി ഓർ ഫാക്ട് റെപ്രസെൻറ്റിംഗ് the quality or the fact of representing a person or a thing, person or a thing, just that is accurate and true to life. The person or thing which is accurate and true to life. യഥാർത്ഥമായി കാണിക്കുന്നത് ഒരു വ്യക്തി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു വസ്തു, അതിനെ യഥാർത്ഥമായി അങ്ങ് യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തോടെ അങ്ങ് കാണിക്കുന്നതാണ് റിയലിസം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. What is of course realism? Realism is the quality or fact representing a person or a thing that is accurate and true to life. True to life. That is what is realism. Once again I will say, realism means the quality or fact of representing a person or a thing that is accurate and true to life. യഥാർത്ഥമായി കാര്യങ്ങൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നതാണ് റിയലിസം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. Then what is surrealism? Surrealism is a 20th century avant-garde movement in art. Surrealism is a 20th century avant-garde movement in art and literature, which is sought to produce a release, which tried to produce a release the creative potential of the unconscious mind. For example, the rational juxtaposition of images. സർറിയലിസ്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ 20ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിൽ പരീക്ഷണാടിസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ വന്ന ഒരു പ്രസ്ഥാനമാണ് ആർട്ടിലും അതുപോലെ സാഹിത്യത്തിലും. അതിലെന്താ ചെയ്യുന്നത്, നമ്മുടെ അബോധ മനസ്സിൻ്റെ കഴിവിനെ ക്രിയേറ്റീവായി, പൊട്ടൻഷ്യലായ ശക്തിമത്തായ കഴിവിനെ ക്രിയേറ്റീവായി ലിറ്ററേച്ചറിലൂടെയോ ആർട്ടിലൂടെയോ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്ന രീതിയാണ് സർറിയലിസം. ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വാട്ട് ഈസ് സർറിയലിസം. What is surrealism? A 20th century avant-garde movement in art and literature which is sought to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind. For example, the irrational juxtaposition, യുക്തിരഹിതമായ juxtaposition, മാറ്റിമറിക്കൽ of images. Then surrealist cinema is a modernist approach. Surrealist cinema is a modernist approach to film theory, criticism and production with origins in Paris in the 1920s. The movement used shocking, irrational and absurd imagery and Freudian dream symbolism to challenge the traditional function of art to represent reality. ഇപ്പോൾ സർറിയലിസം അതാണെങ്കിൽ സർറിയലിസ്റ്റ് സിനിമ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്താണ്? ഇറ്റ് ഇസ് എ മോഡേണിസ്റ്റ് അപ്രോച്ച്, ഒരു ആധുനിക സമീപനമാണ്. ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ മോഡേണിസ്റ്റ് അപ്രോച്ച് ടു ഫിലിം തിയറി, ക്രിറ്റിസിസം ആൻഡ് പ്രൊഡക്ഷൻ. ഫിലിം തിയറിയോടും വിമർശനത്തോടും പ്രൊഡക്ഷനോടുമുള്ള ഒരു മോഡേണിസ്റ്റ് അപ്രോച്ച് വിത്ത് ഒറിജിൻസ് ഇൻ പാരീസ് ഇൻ ദി 1920s. 1920കളിൽ പാരീസിലാണ്, ഫ്രാൻസിൻ്റെ തലസ്ഥാനമായ പാരീസിലാണ് ഇത് ആവിർഭവിച്ചത്. This movement used shocking, irrational or absurd imagery and Freudian dream symbolism to challenge the traditional function of art to represent reality. അതായത് റിയാലിറ്റിയെ പ്രതിനിധാനം ചെയ്യാനായി പരമ്പരാഗതമായ രീതിയല്ല ഉപയോഗിച്ചത്. സറിയലിസത്തിൽ റിയാലിറ്റിയെ റെപ്രസെൻ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ കൺവെൻഷനലായ ട്രഡീഷണലായ ആർട്ടിൻ്റെ ഫങ്ഷനല്ല ഉപയോഗിച്ചത്. പിന്നെന്താണ്? വളരെ ഷോക്കിംഗ് ആയ ഇറാഷണൽ, യുക്തിരഹിതമായ, അബ്സേഡ്, ഫൂളിഷ്, സ്റ്റുപ്പിഡ്, അബ്സേഡ് ഇമേജറി, വളരെ ഷോക്കിംഗ് ആയ, ഇറാഷണലായ, അബ്സേഡായ ഇമേജറിയാണ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത്. കൂടാതെ തന്നെ സിഗ്മണ്ട് ഫ്രോയിഡിൻ്റെ ഈ ഇൻ്റർപ്രട്ടേഷൻ ഓഫ് ദി ഡ്രീം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന അതിൻ്റെ സിംബലിസം, സ്വപ്നങ്ങൾ കാണുന്നു, ആ സ്വപ്നങ്ങളുടെ ആ ഒരു സിംബൽ ഉപയോഗിച്ചുമാണ് റിയാലിറ്റിയെ റെപ്രസെൻ്റ് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് സറിയലിസ്റ്റിക് സിനിമകളിലൂടെ കൊണ്ടുപോകും. എന്താണ് ഫ്രോയിഡിൻ്റെ സ്വപ്നങ്ങൾ? നായകൻ എങ്ങനെ സ്വപ്നം കാണുന്നു, അങ്ങനെ സ്വപ്നം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന സിംബോളിക്കായിട്ട് എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു വരാനിരിക്കുന്ന സംഭവത്തിൻ്റെ സിംബലായി മാറുന്നു. അങ്ങനെ കാണിക്കുന്ന രീതിയായിരുന്നു ഈ സറിയലിസ്റ്റിക്ക്. അപ്പോൾ സറിയലിസത്തിലൂടെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് റിയാലിറ്റി അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്? ത്രൂ ഷോക്കിംഗ്, ഇറാഷണൽ, അബ്സേർഡ് ഇമേജറി ആൻഡ് ഫ്രോയിഡിയൻ ഡ്രീം സിംബലിസം. അതിലൂടെയാണ് റിയാലിറ്റിയെ റെപ്രസെൻ്റ് ചെയ്തിരുന്നത്. സോ വാട്ട് ഈസ് സറിയലിസ്റ്റിക് സിനിമ? Surrealistic cinema is a modernist approach to film theory, criticism and production with origins in Paris in 1920s. This movement used shocking, irrational and absurd imagery and Freudian dream symbolism to challenge the traditional function of art to represent the reality. Poetic symbolism or poetic realism thrived. Poetic symbolism, or what we have been learning, poetic realism thrived, flourished, developed in the narrative of these films, in the narrative of the films during this period, which entertained the notion of fatalism. You know, the poetic symbolist films or poetic realist films, you know, entertained the notion means idea of fatalism, vithi, fatalism. What is fatalism? It is a philosophy. It is a philosophic doctrine that stresses the subjugation of all events and actions to fate or destiny. അതായത് എല്ലാ കാര്യങ്ങളും, എല്ലാ സംഭവങ്ങളും ഉണ്ടാകുന്നത് വിധി മൂലമാണ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു വയ്ക്കുന്ന ഫിലോസഫിക്കൽ ഡോക്ട്രിൻ, ആ ഫെയ്റ്റിന് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഡെസ്റ്റിനിക്ക്, വിധിക്ക് പ്രാധാന്യം കൊടുക്കുന്ന ഡോക്ട്രിനാണ് നമ്മൾ ഫെയ്റ്റലിസം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഈ പോയറ്റിക് റിയലിസ്റ്റിക് ഫിലിംസ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പോയറ്റിക് സിംബലിസ്റ്റ് ഫിലിംസ് എന്തിനാണ് പ്രാധാന്യം കൊടുത്തിരുന്നത്? ഫെയ്റ്റലിസം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ആ ഡോക്ട്രിന്, ആ ഫിലോസഫിക്കൽ ഡോക്ട്രിനാണ് പ്രാധാന്യം കൊടുത്തിരുന്നത്. So poetic symbolism thrived in the narrative of these films, in the story of these films. Narrative here means story of these films, which entertained, which showed, which exhibited the idea of fatalism, the essential doom of the male protagonist. You know, these films had stressed the essential, the indispensable or inevitable doom. Doom means destruction. Indispensable or inevitable doom of the male protagonist or the hero through the narrative technique of the film, through the narrative techniques such as mise-en-scène, lighting, decorations, etc. Through the narrative techniques of the film, the filmmakers brought about the doom of the hero or the male protagonist in these films, in these poetic realist films or films of poetic realism. You know, the essential doom of the hero or the male protagonist was conveyed through the narrative techniques of the film. Which were the narrative techniques used to convey the essential doom of the male protagonist or the hero? the mise-en-scène or the setting, gestures of the characters, movement in the frame, movement, verbal and non-verbal communication. Verbal communication means dialogues, and non-verbal communications through the body language and gestures or facial expressions. They are the non-verbal communication, verbal and non-verbal communication. And the lighting effect were so contrived, so used to emphasize the degeneration of the protagonist. So these were the narrative techniques used to portray the doom of the male protagonist in such poetic realist films. Which were the narrative techniques used? Setting, gestures, movement, verbal and non-verbal communication, and the lighting effects were so contrived as to emphasize the degeneration, destruction, doom of the protagonist. Side lighting of the hero's face, for showing the destruction or the degenerated condition of the hero, side lighting is used. Side lighting is a method of lighting, placing the camera in a 90-degree angle. That means the light is shown only on one side of the subject. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മുടെ മുഖത്താണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ മുഖത്തിൻ്റെ പകുതി ഭാഗം ഷാഡോ ആയിരിക്കും, പകുതി ഭാഗം മാത്രം ലൈറ്റ്, പകുതി ഷാഡോ. അപ്പം അതാണ് സൈഡ് ലൈറ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. അതൊരു നായകൻ്റെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ഹീറോയുടെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ക്യാരക്ടറിൻ്റെ തന്നെ ഡൂമിനെ, ഡീജനറേഷനെ കാണിക്കാനാണ് സൈഡ് ലൈറ്റിംഗ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നത്. സോ വൺ സൈഡ് ഈസ് ഫിൽഡ് ഇൻ ഷാഡോ, whereas the other side is filled with light. That is side lighting. And the side lighting of the hero's face, part lighting of the space in which he exists. ഇനി സബ്ജക്റ്റ് നിലകൊള്ളുന്ന ആ സ്പേസിൽ പാർട്ട് ലൈറ്റ് ഉപയോഗിക്കുക. ഒരു നിഴൽ കലർന്ന രീതിയിൽ കുറച്ച് മാത്രം വെളിച്ചവിന്യാസം നടത്തുക. കുറച്ച് വെളിച്ചവിന്യാസം നമുക്ക് ഗാങ്സ്റ്റർ മൂവീസിലൊക്കെ കാണാൻ കഴിയുന്ന ഒരു രീതിയാണത്. Part lighting of the space in which he exists, the space in which the subject exists, or the hero or the male protagonist exists, or the highlighting of the objects that are symbolic significance, that are of symbolic significance to the hero, showing in a close-up way, exhibiting in a close-up way the objects that are of symbolic significance, the subjects or the objects which are of symbolic importance to the hero. So these were some of the features which provided an aura of poetic realism to the film. So these techniques, these narrative techniques gave an aura. Aura means a positive ambience, a positive atmosphere, a positive ambience of poetic realism to the film. These narrative techniques gave a poetic ambience to the poetic realism of the film. Then the script writer, the designer of the set designer, and the lighting expert, and the composer of music track colluded. They worked together to achieve the effect created by these films. For achieving the poetic realism, the other elements, other factors which colluded together are the script writer, the designer of the set designer, and the lighting expert. ലൈറ്റ് സംവിധാനം ഒരുക്കുന്നയാൾ, ലൈറ്റിംഗ് എക്സ്പെർട്ട്, ആൻഡ് ദി കമ്പോസർ ഓഫ് ദി മ്യൂസിക് ട്രാക്ക് കമ്പോസ് ചെയ്യുന്ന ആൾ. അതും ഇത്തരം പോയറ്റിക് റിയലിസത്തിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട ഘടകങ്ങളിലൊന്നാണ് മ്യൂസിക് ട്രാക്ക്. They colluded, they worked together to achieve, to realize the effect created by these films. These films mean poetic realist films, or we can say poetic symbolist films. Poetic realist films. They are the French poetic realist films. And you should necessarily watch some of the movies mentioned here. And the next important section we have to study is the New Wave French cinema. French New Wave. Okay, we can learn, we can study in our next class.